Back to the content inside the novel, there were some parallels that I found really intriguing between slavery and marriage, especially from the female, or not just especially, from the female perspective. Was that intentional? Did you intend to bring up these parallels?
I mean, that was another one of those happy coincidences, I think. It's obvious now, but at the time all I was doing was exploring what both characters felt, you know, what Frannie felt and what her mistress, Madame Benham, would have been feeling. And when you look back at it, of course it makes sense, because essentially women in the early 19th century were the property of their husbands with very little agency of their own. And, you know, the irony was that a woman's only escape from the sort of household of her father was to marry. That was the destiny that women were supposed to aim for. But it just meant trading one form of male control for another. And of course, property and one person being the property of another was the fundamental problem with slavery as well. And so when the two women came together, it wasn't immediately obvious to me that, of course, those parallels were going to be drawn. But after I finished the novel, I thought, yes, that's one of those things that sort of come out of the substrata, that there's a reason for this strong connection and identification between the two women, because in a sense, they've had the same experience. But that's not to say that the experience of a privileged 19th century English housewife was in any way as terrible as the experience of a slave on a Jamaican plantation, which would have been an unspeakable experience. And one of the points actually about the novel is how blinded Madame is to the fact that her own circumstances could never have been comparable with Frannie's. But she's always complaining and moaning about her lot. And she's got her blinkers on to the real suffering that, you know, even the people who are responsible for keeping in her in the luxury to which she's accustomed, the people who wash her clothes and prepare her food and make her bed, you know, the servants in her own household, she doesn't really ever understand how much they're suffering to provide her with a relatively privileged life, because she's so concerned with what she's missing. And I thought that was one of the real ironies of her situation.
Was there potentially any underlying social commentary in that, or was it coincidental?
I mean, I think a novel that's written deliberately as social commentary will fail as a novel. But obviously the writer will have his or her own concerns and her own view on the world that will filter into the writing. And a novel has to be driven by a strong sense of having something to say, whether that's through the characters or not. But I think you shouldn't manipulate it. I think you shouldn't set about it in too deliberate a way. What I think that the novel might be saying is that we're all, in relation to our own suffering, selfish. And the novel actually makes this point in relation to Frannie as well, who has to make some very challenging compromises. Whether those are her own choice or not is debatable. But she has to make some very challenging compromises in order to make her way out of suffering and to save herself, so to speak. So we are all short-sighted when it comes to the things that bother us and to our own particular concern about our misfortunes. How far would we go? How selfish would we be? That's one of the questions the novel asks, and I prefer to leave it as a question rather than to sort of impose my own view on what the answer should be.
Do you think that maybe the comparison between Madame's suffering and Frannie's suffering, and putting that into the context of, again, intersection of race and gender, is important to acknowledge? Because both women suffer, but Madame suffers because she is a woman, but she is still white and privileged, and, you know, she's married and she lives in her beautiful home and has her servants, whereas but she feels like I almost had a sense that Madame felt like Frannie could relate to her suffering because they are both women, but then at the same time the suffering that both experienced as women was quite different, to say the least.
Yes, I mean, I've had this experience where I can identify with white women, for example, in relation to many aspects of life, but I can't identify with whatever their particular privileges are as white women. And they can identify with the challenges I face as a woman, but they can never identify with the unique challenges I face as a black woman. There we are divided, and then in relation to our experiences of womanhood, we're united. But I think privilege is a really tricky concept because it is reductive in a way to talk about absolutes in terms of privilege, because it manifests itself in all kinds of ways. And that's, I think, one of the things I was exploring. For example, for me, education is a huge privilege. I come from the Caribbean and I grew up in an island where we didn't necessarily so much have the racial issues, but we may have had issues in relation to who had access to education, and that usually would tie into class or wealth or other forms of privilege. And if we focus only on race, we may lose sight of those other categories, I think. And everyone has their own unique set of privileges and disadvantages and has to come to terms with them in their own way. So although we can have discussions about it, reducing it to general categories, I think it's important to treat people as human beings and to understand their full story when you think about how relatively privileged or disadvantaged they are.